my God. This is the last thing that is going to happen at the Louisiana Literary Festival this year, and what a thrill. Actually, we could already leave because it's too good to be true. Richard Ford, Colm Tóibín, in the same room.
Hello. How are you?
We're often in the same room, actually.
I know. And I only have one question. You have been talking to each other constantly during 4 days. What have you actually been talking about?
Real estate.
That's a literary answer. That doesn't count.
I think that writers have a duty to be silly when they're not writing. And when they are writing, they have a duty not to be silly. And it's often quite difficult then to explain to people, look, I'm just being silly because all day I was not being silly.
Right.
Does that,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Although occasionally, a book will come up. But what we probably don't do is what people think we do, which is to say, I've got this problem with this issue in my book. Do you have 5 minutes to sort of look at this? We don't do that. Maybe lawyers do that. We
Or real estate people.
Real estate people, maybe they do. No, we've known each other a long time, and we actually end up seeing each other mostly off the lot, because both of us teach at Columbia in New York City, and once in a while I'll see you, we wave. Yeah.
What does that mean?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Means I'm okay. Are you okay?
I'm awesome.
I'm awesome.
We had this can seem a bit too familiar, but we have, Richard Ford has idiosyncrasies with certain words, and one of them is awesome. So I was going to say, can I say I am in awe at having you two here? Would that be okay?
No, that would be all right.
But then if I didn't think it said, it's so awesome, you would just get up and leave. Well, we are here to celebrate, anyway, literature and your 2 recent books and all your books and all the amazing amount of literary awards that I'm not going to mention because I would be embarrassed on your behalf because you have so many.
And we would just be darkly pissed because we're thinking about all the ones we didn't win.
Yeah, the ones you were shortlisted for, and somebody else won in that year.
Wrongly.
Nobody talks about that book anymore. It's all over for that person.
Is it worse being shortlisted than not being shortlisted?
The art of losing isn't hard to master.
No. Jesus, there's only one thing worth it. It's winning.
Actually, Richard Ford, when he's not talking about literature backstage, has been writing. Thank you for the Literary F. Scott Fitzgerald Award that you haven't received yet, but which is coming up.
Yeah, I think it doesn't matter. You win an award named after a sort of overpraised guy who wrote a couple of good books and who was a drunk all of his life.
What's the matter with it? Let's not get moralistic. No, let's get straight to literature, because for those few of you who haven't read the 2 recent books of these gentlemen, we have asked them to read a small part each, and then we will jump straight into everything else.
Okay.
Will you start?
Sure, yeah. Nora Webster is a widow, and she hasn't really gone out since her husband died. And people want her to go out. They think she should go out. The problem is the first time she goes out is with her friend Phyllis. And Phyllis is very grand. She's from Dublin. Nora Webster is not from Dublin, and there's a big distinction. And Phyllis has a very grand voice, and she's very imperious. Nora doesn't really know her. And because she's so used to going out with her husband, she can't believe she has to go out with this woman and spend the whole evening in this situation. The problem is there's a quiz. That's what they're going to do. Nora's going to keep the score, and Phyllis is going to ask the questions. The second problem is that Nora knows all the people who are being asked the questions because she used to come here with her husband on their holidays. Phyllis, of course, knows nobody. And so just imagine there are all these country people in a small place. It's not even a town, it's not even a village, and they're being asked questions by this really grand woman from Dublin. By the time the 6-mark questions began, the Blackwater team was slightly ahead. And then Phyllis demands silence for the next round, which are questions about classical music. How many symphonies did Brahms compose? Phyllis asked. Nora watched the man from Kilmuckridge, which is one of the villages. He bided his time as though he was trying to remember something he once knew. When Phyllis announced that she was activating the stopwatch, he said, 25. Phyllis looked contemptuously around the hall, leaving a silence. Nora looked down at the score sheet. As everyone knows, Phyllis said, Brahms wrote 4 symphonies, 25 indeed. There was a hush at the next question. How many symphonies did Schumann write? It was the turn of the retired school teacher from Blackwater. I'll guess 9, he said quietly. Wrong, Phyllis said. He wrote 4. She took them then through Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Mahler, Sibelius, and Bruckner, to stunned silence as each name was called out and each contestant failed to guess the correct number of symphonies. When she listed operas and asked them the name of the composer, both the retired teacher and the young man from the Blackwater team knew the answers. This put Blackwater ahead by 15 points as she came to the last rounds, when the contestants could consult with each other. When one of them asked for a toilet break, Phyllis agreed. Another brandy and soda, because they'd been drinking steadily throughout, and Babysham arrived on the table. When Nora looked over towards the door, she noticed that a few men had gathered there. They were looking at herself and Phyllis with suspicion and resentment. One of them, a young man with sandy hair and a sunburned face, glanced back at his associates when he saw that Nora was watching him. As he approached her, he appeared personally aggrieved. She's a queer, big, grand voice, that one, he said, nodding towards Phyllis. I hope she's not thinking of driving through Kilmuckridge tonight, because there are a few lads are sore enough at her, and the voice on her. She thinks she's someone. I'll say that for her. Nora looked away and did not reply. I'll tell you now, he said to another man, she'd get a great big fright if someone stuck one of her symphonies up her hole. She wouldn't be asking questions then. Phyllis whispered to Nora that they should proceed with the quiz as soon as they could. Now, everybody, she shouted, get ready for the last exciting round. Mrs. Webster will give us a score so far. The man continued to hover until Phyllis turned her full attention on him. I'm afraid you are in the way, she said, and there's no reason for you to stand so close. Could you go back and sit down? The man hesitated and then gave her a look of pure contempt before he went back to his friends at the doorway. One of the Kilmuckridge contestants had obviously prepared for this round of questions about the prime ministers and presidents of various countries. He was able to give the names of the prime ministers of both Norway and Sweden. It was when the team was asked the name of the prime minister of the Soviet Union. They agreed first on Brezhnev and then changed to Podgorny that the problems arose. Which is it? Phyllis asked. They consulted for a while until Phyllis set the stopwatch. It's Podgorny, one of them said. I'm afraid you are wrong with both of your answers. The premier of the Soviet Union is Kosygin. You asked the name of the prime minister, one of them said, and that is Kosygin. You just said he is the premier, and that is the same as prime minister, and my decision is final. I'm afraid you can argue all you like. Now, next question. As murmurs came from all around, Phyllis raised her voice. I will have no more interruptions. Nora concentrated on the score sheet and was afraid to look up. By the end of the round, since the Blackwater team had failed to answer some of the questions, there were only 3 points between the teams. It was clear to Nora, and she presumed to many in the hall, that if the Soviet Union answer had been allowed, then Kilmuckridge would be ahead. In the last round, which focused on famous battles, each team managed to answer every question correctly. By the time the quiz ended, Nora had a score sheet totted up. Blackwater had won by 3 points. Phyllis got to her feet and demanded silence and read out the result in an imperious voice. Before she'd even time to sit down, a man emerged from the crowd and moved towards her. He was wearing a cap and a check jacket. Where are you from? He asked Philip aggressively. What has it to do with you? She replied. You're not even from Enniscorthy. He said, you're a blow-in. And you've no right to push your weight around down here. Maybe it's time you went home, Phyllis said. At least I know where my home is. You robbed us, another man shouted. That's all there is to it.
I think it's an absolutely amazing scene because I get so my hands sweat every time I hear it because it's so nerve-wracking. It's so funny, but it's so threatening at the same time, because actually she is way beyond, and she has no sense of what is going on. It's really scary.
Yeah, I don't think it's really scary, but I mean, in those towns and villages, there's an awful hatred for Dublin people. And you just say, she was from Dublin, they just say. And they wouldn't need to say anything more, meaning that they were just...
But I mean, it's not perhaps really scary, but it's scary in the sense that they have to be saved both from themselves, but also from their drunken state, because they actually start drinking too much. They're not supposed to drink at all.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the moment where, when they go back to the pub, Phyllis, who's been drinking these brandy and sodas without noticing, gets really drunk. And it's really hard to do drunkenness in a novel, but the best way of doing it is pretend they're not drunk, they just talk too much, or don't have them swaying around. And in fact, she drives home in a perfectly straight line, more or less. And of course, they start singing. And it's the singing then that leads to everything else in the rest of the book, where she suddenly says to Nora, "You have an extraordinary singing voice." And Nora says, no, you know, she's nervous always about herself. No, I don't. My mother did, but I don't. And, no, you do. But of course, if anyone has ever tried to sing in a pub, I don't know what happens here, but in Ireland, but you really want to be very good, because they try and sing Brahms' Lullaby in both German and English. And people think this is desperately funny. And there's a crowd in the corner that just keep laughing. And even when they try and sing beautifully, the crowd laugh even more. And then they go out of tune. The crowd just thinks this is, you know. And what's mentioned here, which is absolutely true, is this will be talked about for years afterwards. People say, those two women, the two women who sang. And that will be mentioned forever, you know.
I think this is so characteristic of the whole book. Not much has to happen. Nothing scandalous. It doesn't have to, you know, a plane doesn't have to crash next to the village or anything. You just have to sing a bit drunken, a bit too sort of self-consciously, and then you were the ones who sang. So little things are happening that have really big consequences.
Yeah, I was interested in that idea that Nora is out without her anchor, and that up to then she would always be conscious of her husband, when he wanted to go, who he was talking to, what was going on with him. And now she realizes there's no anchor at all. And that this then means that she's almost that half her is almost missing for social occasions. And so I'm just trying to dramatize that in a way by giving her and bringing her back to the place where she thought she'd never go back to, which is filled with those sort of memories. You know? And it's a funny part of Ireland in the sense that, you know, it's not like the rocky west of Ireland, where perhaps there's a lot more drama going on. It's the east coast of Ireland with very gentle waves like here, and people don't tend to say what they're thinking about ever. So just someone would be enough if someone looked at you to know that something had happened. And there's a lot of coastal erosion, and I missed the fact that this house had, well, it really had fallen into the sea, and the people had to go. And so when I arrived down the next time, I knew there was news of something had happened, but they would never tell you straight out. They'd just say, yeah. No, they went into the village. Meaning, of course, their house had gone, and they had nowhere else to go into the village. But they would never tell you the whole story, and they just presume you'd pick up that was a disaster had occurred. You know,
well, talking about disaster, let me be frank with you, is based on disaster.
It is. It's
houses, not one house, but many houses falling into the sea.
It's occasioned, and at least my writing it was occasioned by Hurricane Sandy on the east coast of New York, and going down to visit the aftermath of the hurricane, and then being moved by it in a way that I didn't really expect to be quite the way it was. And you know, Catherine Ann Porter calls the beginning of her famous story, Flowering Judas, she calls it a commotion in the mind. And she remembers in 1921 walking down a little paseo in Mexico City, and she happens to look in a window and sees a very fat man kneeling in front of a very beautiful woman. That's all she saw. And that she called the commotion in the mind, which was the commencement of her writing that story. The commotion in my mind was to think about the aftermath of the hurricane and what could it be that the news wouldn't have picked up. Yeah.
Would you read a bit for us too?
Sure. This little bit here get me specs. This little bit here takes place in the state of New Jersey, where actually most things in the world take place. This is Frank Bascom speaking about a conversation that he has with his wife. And they are living in the aftermath of this hurricane. And she comes in and she says, later yesterday morning after I spoke to my friend Arnie, my wife Sally came downstairs to where I was eating my all-bran and stood staring, musing through the window into the backyard at the late autumn squirrel activity. I was pleased to be thinking nothing worth recording, not about Arnie Urquhart, my friend, in trouble, just breathing to the cadences of my shoes. After a while of not speaking, she sat down across from me, holding a book I'd noticed her reading late into the night. Her light stayed on after I'd gone to sleep, then was switched off, then on again. It's not unusual for people our age. I read this shocking thing last night. She held a book she'd been engrossed by, clutched to her yoga shirt. Her eyes were intent. She seemed worried. I couldn't make out the book's spine, but understood she meant to tell me about it. Tell me, I said. Well, she pursed her lips. Back in 1862, right when the Civil War was in full swing, the U.S. cavalry had time to put down an Indian revolt in Minnesota. Did you know that? I did, I said. The Dakota uprising is pretty famous. Okay, you knew about it, I didn't. I know some things, I said, and stared down at a banana slice. Okay. But in December 1862, our government hanged 38 Sioux warriors in one big scaffold, just did it all at once. That's famous too, I said. Supposedly they'd massacred 800 white people, not that that's an excuse. Sally took in a breath and turned her head away in a manner to indicate a tear she didn't want seen might be wobbling out of her eyes. But do you know what they said? These words were nearly choked with throat-clogging emotion. What, who said? I asked. The Indians. They all began shouting out as they were standing on the gallows, waiting to drop and never speak again. I didn't know, but I looked up to let her understand I realized this was important to her and that the next thing she said would be important to me. Possibly my spoon had paused on its upward arc toward my mouth. I may have shaken my head in amazement. They all shouted, "I'm here." They started calling out that in their Sioux language all around that awful contraption that was about to kill them. People who heard it said it was awe-inspiring, not awesome. No one ever forgot it. Then they hanged them, all of them, at one moment. I'm here, as if that made it all right for them, made death tolerable and less awful. It gave them strength. Sally shook her head. Her tear of anguish for long ago, 1862, did not emerge. She held her book tight to her front and smiled at me mournfully across the glass-topped table where I've eaten possibly 3,000 breakfasts. I just thought you'd want to know about that. I'm sorry to ruin your breakfast. I'm glad to know about it, sweetheart. I said it didn't ruin my breakfast at all. I'm here, she said, and seemed to embarrass herself. So am I said. And with these words, she got up, came around the square table, kissed me once on my forehead, still embarrassed, then went away, carrying her book back to where she'd come from in the house. So.
I'm here is a theme in Let Me Be Frank with You. It's 4 novellas, and everybody is somehow bearing witness to other people's problems.
Right. Yeah. That isn't what I started out thinking it was about. I had that little anecdote in my notebook, and at a certain point I wanted to kind of slam it in there somewhere. And then when I had that line, I'm here, I thought, well, that's really about bearing witness, isn't it? And so that was the first book of these 4, and I wrote them in the order in which they occur. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if I can embroider and darn a bit on that notion. And so the other 3 stories in the book were sort of written with that in the back of my mind, as you know. one of the things you said about Colm's piece is that nothing enormous needs to happen. And one of the things we do as novelists is that we make things happen where and when it might appear to others that nothing is, as a way of saying, pay attention. Pay attention to something that you might otherwise be missing. And so, I mean, I could have written those other 3 stories and thought that they were about something else, perhaps, and made them, forced them to be about something else. But when I really noticed that what was interesting me was bearing witness, then that's how the other stories were informed. And again, on the surface of things, it might seem that other things are happening, or it might seem that things were not happening at all. But bearing witness is both an active and a passive seeming kind of gesture.
Could I, as a reader, be bearing witness to what you have written? Could that be part of the situation?
I wouldn't ordinarily think so, but I mean, who's to say? That's in a way a choice for you to make. Mm. It isn't. As Colm said yesterday in his conversation, we write these books for readers. Mm. And as Sartre has said, books don't get to be beautiful until they have escaped their maker. And so when it escapes me, its maker, and gets into your brain, then you do with it the best you know how.
There's another thing which is, I wanted you to talk about the time you write in, the actual time when you are writing in, and the time you write about, because it's not the same. I mean, you go back in time, or you are in the time. And you have in your Let Me Be Frank book a grief counselor. And in your book, grief is a big issue, but nobody knows how to give it a name.
It's
so there's something has really happened from when you wrote, not that you wrote it now, but the time that it plays out in. Grief as...
I don't know if it happens, frankly speaking, I don't know that much about grief counselors. It's mostly when I think about grief counselors, I think it's kind of a joke. So I don't know if grief is any better counseled now than it was in 1968. We may have some kind of a virtual vocabulary for the counseling of grief, but I don't know that it's done any differently intimately.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things you can do in a novel that you can't really do in film or you can't really do in drama is that you can show what the character is feeling or even thinking or even wanting to say, and then you can show what the character actually says, and you can show the distance between those 2 things. And the reader can get to know, the distance is, the drama is in that distance. So it doesn't matter, as you say, how small the drama is, because it's somebody is feeling the opposite of what they're saying. And I suppose grief is interesting in that sense because people may be feeling it in waves. It may come and go. It may be there all the time for a given day. And yet people will try, or at least some of the time, not to talk about it. And therefore that will become a way for the reader to enter into 2 spirits, but into 3 perhaps, into the third one being the silence, the thing not said. And the thing not said becomes therefore the most sort of powerful thing. For example, in what you've just read there's almost a tension within the marriage over her wanting to say something to him that morning. It may be something else,
right?
And the reader knows, and the reader is watching them to see. And this can be as large as the Battle of Waterloo, in the tension that you build between what's said and not said.
Colm has said in between about 3 or 4 times, and that certainly is the space that we work in. There's this great little fragment from Octavio Paz, which goes between what I see and what I say, between what I say and what I keep silent, between what I keep silent and what I dream, between what I dream and what I forget is poetry. So we're always in that little hyperspace there between what I see and what I say, and that's the opportunity, because you have to make that space up. It doesn't exist if you don't make it up.
Yeah. Can I ask Richard
a
question?
I'm just here to listen.
I'm wondering if you could just talk to us about that use of the first person, and just maybe with this book, with the Frank Bascombe book, and with Canada, where because you're using a first-person singular, the reader has a right to feel at a certain point, such as the opening, that this is going to be a confession, that everything is going to now be said by this person who is writing, stroke, speaking. You're not quite sure which, because it's a literary form. Right. But yet, the reader ends up knowing more about the boy in Canada than the boy in how he's feeling, than the boy in Canada is ready to declare or knows. And you're playing with that, with his voice, by giving him a tone. And out of the tone comes great knowledge for the reader. But his tone doesn't give him the knowledge.
That's right. I think something has to do with the fact that it is a literary form. It is a piece of artifice. And it's acknowledged to be a piece of artifice both by me and by the reader. So we know that this is, even though it may be confessional in its surfaces, it is in fact not confessional in its nature, because ultimately I don't make it be that way. I don't make it be a confession. And this is why the notion of the unreliable narrator is always interesting to me, because it's a kind of a misnomer, because narrators are always unreliable insofar as the reader will bring a heightened intelligence to what she or he is reading, and will know more than the characters do, because you're standing outside the book and they're locked inside the book.
But I mean, aren't there two forms of unreliable narration? One where you realize that the narrator is slowly telling you lies.
Well, yes.
And the one where the narrator, such as the narrator in Canada, for example, or Frank, actually are trying to tell you everything. But you're learning more than they're learning by what they're saying. But they're attempting to be honest or frank.
Well, I just always think that I'm trying to give the illusion that they're trying to tell you everything, but because of the economies of the book, I mean, it's sort of a little bit like if you wanted to write a short story based on
somebody is.
I'm not doing anything.
But you are.
Everything you see is what I'm doing.
You're the unreliable narrator.
He's the unreliable speaker here.
But I don't think it's making. Oh, it is down. If you decided you were going to write a short story based upon what two people said at the breakfast table in the morning, and then what you decided you would do would just be to record two people having breakfast in the morning, you would quickly understand that you do not have a short story there. What you have is just a conversation between two real people, which is different from a piece of artifice. So, I mean, I know exactly what you mean about there being two or three different kinds of unreliable narrators, but I always sort of use Occam's razor on that, so as to empower the reader to make her or his decisions about whatever he or she is reading. And inevitably, readers will know more than what's going on the page, whether it's Jane Austen or whoever it is. It all, to me. We all have, people who do what we do, we have different sort of parlance for what we do. I mean, for me, it all depends on it being artifice. And given Frank O'Connor said there are 12, at least 12 different forms of verisimilitude. I'm just operating in one.
But how about continuing a bit on this line? When you write, for instance, the Frank Bascombe voice, do you have sort of messages you want to get across the table? Because there are lots of things going on, and politics sort of play a role. They do also in Nora Webster, but in a more indirect way.
Colm talked about this yesterday, that in some ways you stick in that bit in Nora Webster about what they see on television and the baton charge as a way of both framing it temporarily, and also maybe as an opportunity to get in something that you had in your notebook or in your perfect memory.
Thank you.
You had it, and so you got it, and so you want to use it, and then so you sort of slam it in there.
You don't have a perfect memory, Richard Ford?
I don't. I've got a good one, but I don't have one as good as his.
Just to follow on from that, can you talk about the idea then of finding this? I'm asking you this really because I can't do it. that if I move into the first person singular, I end up with a voice that is filled with some sort of flavor that often is not intended by me. I just can't do it. And I'm just wondering about that idea of finding a first person, someone's voice, and letting it be theirs, and not intervening with it you, just leaving it to be theirs, and giving them a sort of, I don't know what the word would be, but just let's say a calm poetry in their tone, but which isn't obvious to the reader, and slowly becomes powerful without the reader knowing at what point it becomes powerful.
Well, the persona of the 4 books, so there's 4 different kinds of persona, really. But the first time I took a crack at writing Frank Bascom in 1862, these books take a while. It's not easy. In 1982, I had been reading Joe Heller's book, Something Happened. And I had been reading Walker Percy's book, The Moviegoer. And I had been reading Frederick Exley's book, Fan's Notes. And what I saw was that what those books could all do was be both funny and smart, which is what I wanted to do. I wanted to be funny and smart on the page. And so that was my guide in a way. So whenever I would find myself going outside some invisible boundaries, I would sort of haul it back in a way, unless I wrote something that went outside of those boundaries that I thought was extraordinary and therefore wanted to keep. Because when you write a book in the third person or you write a book in the first person, you're sort of hearing something as you work along. But it's not a terribly constricted kind of operation, because you do want the advantage of if you should have a brilliant moment of slamming it in there, putting it in the story. So you're operating with a voice, and sometimes the voice goes outside its boundaries, and you think, well, is the reader getting enough? If I break the tone of the book, if I break the tenor of the voice, is the reader getting enough to make that be okay? So that probably is the only way to operate. I mean, if you read Nora Webster, which is in the third person, and you said it was sort of a close, what would you call it, an intimate third? It is a kind of intimate third, free and direct style. You could call it free and direct style. It seems to be doing one thing most of the time, which is to say an omniscient narrator is telling you what Nora's doing and what Nora's thinking and what other people are saying to her, not what anybody else is thinking except in her surmise. But every once in a while, you'll just simply deviate from that. And you deviate from it when you do, in behalf of something that you have decided is worth the risk of the deviation. I'll just write a really brilliant line. I will read one. May I read one?
Well, it'd be great if you would.
I've got 3 or 4 marked here. This is when books are smart. This is how books get smart. Nora did not sleep. She glanced at the newspaper she had bought in the station and put it down and watched the 2 boys slumped back in their seats. They're taking a train trip. She would love to have known just then what they were dreaming. In these months, she realized something had changed, and I would hear what Nora's thinking, had changed in the clear, easy connection between her and them, and perhaps for them between each other. And here's the whip crack. She felt that she would never be sure about them again. That's just this man talking here and making her think it, but because that's a piece of imagination on the basis of what that paragraph was telling you about. It doesn't naturally come to that conclusion. He makes it come to that conclusion, and what he does, he gets outside a little bit of the vernacular, outside a little bit of the tenor of her voice. Don't you?
Yeah, I would still argue, though, that that can still be, in that second, as you think, a black thought comes for a second, which she almost doesn't think. And it's that. And it has to be short and brisk like that she doesn't follow up on.
Right.
It has to be very difficult for her, something she stops herself doing when she does, that she would never be able to do something again. So I would argue that that's still within her.
Well, I see.
You know,
I would
if-
argue
if
that you
I-
make it be within her.
Well, yeah, but if I had noticed that, I would have taken it out. You know. You know.
But see, see what I wrote in the margin.
What?
I said leap whack, and I love it. I mean, I think that's what you've made it be part of her interior, whereas she has no interior. She doesn't exist. She's just this paragraph there. And you come and you're manhandling that paragraph at the end to accommodate something that you yourself dream up and make her feel and think, and you make it completely persuasive by doing so.
You see, I think the thing there is not to put in a poetic term or to heighten the language. It's to bring the language down to its Anglo-Saxon root. You know, even a Latin. Is there a Latin word in that? There shouldn't be.
Is it QUOD? I didn't read it. What does it mean?
But I mean that you try and make it as plain as possible so that it can seem to be within her mind then, rather than you writing. Right. I mean, I think that's the issue, isn't it?
It is.
Where if anyone starts imagining, oh, there he is at home writing. He's not typing, it's much worse. He's writing. And I mean, in Canada, you must have had this problem of dealing with the idea of how much he knew later, how much he knew at the time, and who you are as you're working on this, trying to deal, for example, with his modesty, with how quiet he is, with how careful he is. That you cannot intervene in that, isn't that? But at the same time, sorry, but he has to notice everything as well.
You know, what you're hearing is between the two of us is he believes in things a little more than I do, I think. I mean, in the sense that you believe that line. When you have Nora think that line, you believe it. And what I think is, what a brilliant line to have dreamed up. and when I'm operating in those betwixt areas there, I'm always thinking to myself, we have a compact, the writer and the reader, which is that I'm making this stuff up. And if I can lean on you enough to make you think something that you wouldn't have thought otherwise, you'll forgive me for leaning on you in the way that I think novels do.
I would say as a reader, because this is the conversation you said you were never having backstage. And I imagine this is a very eloquent literary conversation about details. And if I can say, just as the dumb journalist I am, when I read Nora Webster, for instance, as opposed to, let me be frank with you, with Nora Webster, I have the feeling that somebody has just lowered his voice and wants to tell me something. I have to lean in a little to hear, what is it actually that you're saying? And then when I've leaned in enough, I just read, gosh, is this it? Oh my God. And when I'm reading Let Me Be Frank With You, it's like the hurricane is rolling through the pages. I mean, this is post-Sandy, but the hurricane is on the pages. It's a different kind of energy. I know this is a very, perhaps...
No, it's just how you experience it.
That's how I experience it. And I never go into thinking so precisely what is it that is actually going on with the first person or the narrative. Obviously, I'm just. It's two very different ways of writing, but the outcome is like somebody speaking in a loud voice as opposed to somebody speaking in a lower voice.
It's amazing we can talk to each other at all.
I mean, one of the problems that I would have with the first person, if this were written in the first person, would be regional flavour. That this woman is from a particular part of Ireland in a particular year. There are certain phrases she will use, and how much of that to put in. I mean, one of the advantages, in a way, you have, but I'm not sure it's a full advantage, is that the American language has become a sort of official English, in a way that regional Irish speech remains a sort of hidden thing. I mean, there are both advantages and disadvantages in that. But sometimes when Frank Bascombe speaks, I realize that anyone in Ireland reading this will understand every term he uses, everything is watching, everything is noticing, you know, from the Old Bran to the to the American Civil War. Whereas in Ireland, oh God, we had our own Civil War. Should I explain more about it to the outside? You know,
so the third person in a way protects you from having to do that.
From having to worry I mean, in a way, I think if you're working from Ireland, and I imagine this is true about Denmark or any country, any small country, is that you have to constantly watch it in case you begin to explain your country to the outside world. In case you say, you know, they watched it on RTE, the Irish television channel. No, seriously, because otherwise someone will write you and say, well, this RTE, like what was that? We got bogged down in all those initials. We couldn't work out, you know. Do you know what I mean? Whereas if you just write Amtrak, everyone will know. You write New Jersey, everyone. You know what I mean?
But when you write, but I think that when I write this book, that I'm writing as from my principal audience, who will be people in the United States. Now, that's who I think is my principal audience. When you write Nora Webster, do you think that your principal audience is going to be people in Ireland, or do you not?
It would almost be Wexford rather than Ireland. I mean, it would almost be narrowed down into things. I mean, there are even phrases in that bit I read that would only really someone in Wexford would get the full meaning of.
But the book has all kinds of. Well, I shouldn't say all kinds of, but there are plenty of little inflective phrases in the book which come in not in the dialogue, but sometimes come in the narration, which flavor it as being what it is.
But what I suppose I'm wondering is if there is such a thing as a standard American language now. That you know, in other words, are you conscious of in Canada where he is in America, or with Frank that he is in New Jersey, and there's a word he will use that someone further in the South or in the West Coast won't use?
I think that there is a kind of a pan-continental language, which is to say, I grew up in the South, and in the South has its own supposed lingo with all kinds of expressions and preoccupations. And what I found in writing stories that are set, not about, but set in a putative New Jersey or a putative Montana, that I can pretty well take what I brought from the South up to those places and it will be plausible. That I can use certain Southern expressions, put it in the mouth or put it in the narration of somebody who's living in Montana in 1960, and nobody will much call attention to it. Okay. And I don't know if that quite is what you mean, but the other thing, would I put something in the book that was so specifically New Jersey that it would need explanation? I would only do it if I thought I could get away with making it funny.
But you've done one thing which I thought was really interesting. You explained the other day that to write about the South, you actually left the South. You went south to begin to write.
Yeah.
You've actually changed sort of north and south to get started. Yeah. And to write about coming from the South or something that takes place in the South, you had to take the whole location out first, write the story, and put back in the location.
I did that.
And that you had, I mean, you use your really local place because then it gives you freedom. You know where you are, so you don't have to worry about that.
You mean the place being Spain in the South?
That's your South. That was the South I was referring to because,
I mean, what happened was that I just didn't think that this world of this small coastline with these gentle waves, these small villages and the town, that they would ever yield enough for a novel. I just wasn't sure how you would do that. I thought you would get some short stories and pretty melancholy ones from it, and pretty classic Irish ones. You know, that people were sad, and then they were sad later. What happened was that I was stuck in the first novel. I just couldn't. I was 3/4 way through, and I really couldn't proceed. And a painter had told me that you make a painting, I think Sam Francis might have known this, by just making a mark and then dealing with the mark you've made. And I thought, look, I'm going to close my eyes and any sentence comes into my head, I'm going to write down anything, no matter what it is. The postman came, okay, spring came, anything. And it was the sea, a grey shine on the sea. A grey shine. Well, that's not the Mediterranean. You don't get that on the Mediterranean much. So this is back in Wexford. This is back home. And that chapter brought me back home unexpectedly. And I realized I knew every contour, and I could find a rhythm for that chapter that came easier or seemed to have more in it, more feeling in it. And that really surprised me, because this landscape was now yielding up something that I could begin to work with. And so the next book, I went all the way to it. I went back to it in full, dealt with that low sky, that constant threatening rain, heather blazing with constant use of euphemism, no one saying anything much, silence, solitude, grey skies, long winters, and that I could just work with it. I was very surprised by this. It didn't seem to me to be natural.
So you didn't take Barcelona, where you stayed, into...
I've never really gone back to Barcelona as a novelist to be able to write about it again. It just faded. It's just all its glamour, all its drama, all the civil war, and I was there for all the time when Franco died, all those nights of marches and baton charges. I've just never been able to use it. I mean, maybe I will, but this comes easier now.
And you have sort of reconciled with the South as a place?
Yeah, I have. I had to quit writing about the South because when I was young, because everybody had written about the South better than I was ever going to be able to. It just wasn't any use my doing it. Everything I knew about the South, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, where I grew up, had already been written about by Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner and Eudora Welty and all kinds of people, so I just thought I have nothing to contribute here. So I have to and it was, I can make it sound as if it was painless. It was not painless. It was sort of the equivalent of giving up your vocation and hoping to find another one. Because when you come out of Mississippi and you want to be a novelist, it's just de rigueur that you write about Mississippi. It's what you're supposed to do. But I just wasn't doing it very well. Wasn't doing it successfully. So I just had to sort of leave it behind. And only later, as you were alluding to before, when I wrote A Multitude of Sins, I wrote a story set in New Orleans. And it's a long story called Calling. And normally what would happen to me was that when I would start to write something, a sentence that was set in the South, and I put, it was a cold day in Jackson, Mississippi. Then all of a sudden, I'm hearing Faulkner, and I'm hearing Welty, and I'm hearing, all kinds of things. In other words, I lost control of it. So I wrote this story set in New Orleans without ever saying that it was in New Orleans or without ever putting any of the particulars of the town into the story. The story just basically took place no place. Then when I got it all the way finished, taking place no place, I showed it to Christina, and I said, do you think it would be okay if I just kind of went back in and retrofitted New Orleans into the story? She said, I think it'd be worth trying. Yeah. Then I went back in and did that, and I found that all of those old rhythms weren't rumbling anymore. I could do it more or less the way I would have liked to do it without having those haunting sounds in my head.
I mean, I was very lucky in that there's a novelist 10 years older than me who started writing a good time before I did, and he's better than John Banville, and he's from 10 miles away. We went to the same school. We had the same English teacher. He could have easily got in first here with all this coastline, with all this, low skies with threatening rain, but instead he wrote sort of great, brilliant European novels about ideas of good and evil. I was so lucky that he just didn't bother with this. But I mean, really, really lucky. I wouldn't have been able to do it then because he would have done it and better. But the big problem is, of course, I've spent a lot of my life in Dublin. And one of the things everyone who lives in Dublin knows about is that gorgeous midsummer time when the day is really long and you get a gorgeous day around the 16th of June where the day starts early and you meet everyone you know and you're in the National Library some of the time and then, you're meeting all sorts of people in pubs and then it goes on, you could go on into, and of course you realize, that would be called Ulysses. And it's already been written. And I don't think so. I think you'd better not just keep that midsummer day to your private diaries and tell your grandchildren about it. But if you started it saying, I've got a great novel coming about, please don't, please. Or, everyone in Dublin, know that Christmas parties, the same people, Leopold Bloom called it, what's a nation? The same people in the same place. You know this in Ireland because the same Christmas party happens every year with the same people singing the same songs at the same time, drinking the same drinks, going home at the same hour. And you think the hospitality is wonderful. And you think, I always feel a bit uneasy at the beginning and end of those parties. And yes, I think about sex at an inappropriate moment during them. And yes, someone sings a song that really affects me. Oh, James Joyce is the dead. I mean, don't write your Christmas party story. Don't think of it. It's not, it's over. You know, that's really, I mean, we need really to go up into Mars and the moon and places, but now do we?
If we only could. But you do have to write about the thing that you're going to be the world's greatest expert in, irrespective of what it is. You have to be. I mean, to be the author of something, you have to be the authority over it. That's what it means to be an author. You authorize everything. And if everybody's already authorized what you think that you've got in your kit, you have to go somewhere else.
But just talk to us about the Jersey Shore in this context, then, about it being an unmuddied stream in that sense.
Well, it was an unmuddied stream, but plenty of people have written. Again, I'm not writing about New Jersey. I'm just using the words of the New Jersey lexicon to create a sort of backdrop against which I put principals, characters who run around and do things. And I just take advantage of the language of New Jersey. But I didn't know anybody who had written about it to the extent that I was going to write about it. And I did feel like it was, for me, uncharted ground. And I haven't, over the now some years, 30 plus years since I started doing it, nobody's come along and shown me anything that was doing what I didn't know someone was doing way back in the. You know, Philip Roth wrote about New Jersey a lot and wrote about it in a book like Pastoral better than anybody ever could, but that's Newark.
Yeah. You don't do Newark.
I don't do Newark.
You drove right.
And he does Montclair, and I don't do Montclair. So I just grind along in my little patch.
But there could be another. I mean, you've even done something which could, I mean, inspire awe in many people. You've written a novel about Henry James. And I mean,
a brilliant novel
and
about Henry
a
James.
brilliant, wonderful novel about Henry James. And I mean, just the idea, if you have problems with people who've written brilliant things before, entering into the mind in a novelistic way of Henry James.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that there was enough in him. There were so many ambiguities within him that a novelist could really work with in the way that I couldn't have done with James Joyce, whose appetites or whose interests or his life was known, was clear to me. I mean, that James was neither American nor English in the end, or by the time my book starts. He loves his family, but he got really far away from them and stayed away from them. He loves the company of women, but he's probably homosexual. He loves solitude, but he's always going out in the evening. You know, everything about him, the opposite is true. And so that you can constantly work with that, as though you've got sort of two colors to work with. And you also never know, as you're starting a chapter, where this is going to go at certain points. So he interested me to that extent that even from the biographies, he emerges, as I think, as a very great mystery, as an enigma. And I could work with that in the way that I couldn't work with clarity. I couldn't have worked with George Eliot. I couldn't have worked with anyone whose mind was as clear as Eliot's. So he just began to interest me in that way, that I could never tell what he was thinking on a given day, despite the fact that I would have a notebook entry, a letter, a piece of a novel he was writing. I still couldn't tell. And that's the most interesting idea.
Is that the same for a fiction?
One of those in-between areas.
Yes, yeah.
Because that in-between area is pressurized on both sides by things that you do know. And in fact, in conventional wisdom, we are made to feel that we do know what went on, except of course we do not. And you mind in that in-between area, and that's the kind of special pleading that a novel is. Because a novel wants to say, let me tell you something about this little in-between area between what he said and what he didn't say, that you think you understand, but that I'm going to tell you more than you know, better than you know.
You're both writers who write longhand, right?
Yes, we do. And we have the jacket stains to prove it. I just sent a really nice jacket off to a woman in New York named Madame Isidore, who apparently is magically able to take ink stains out of silk jackets.
Can I get
Yes, you can.
Why?
Why?
Why this? Why this motion?
Well, for me, it's pleasurable, and it's slow, and I can type a lot faster than I can think, and there's no reason to do that.
Yeah, you can touch the page. I write on the right-hand side, leave the left-hand side blank, and then I can go just put an arrow over from a thing and rewrite it on the opposite side. And I can look at it, I can see the two of them. I'm not sure it really makes that much difference, but there is a sense of being able to touch the words that might make a difference.
I mean, form must mean something when you write. Henry James in your novel, and probably in his life, has difficulty writing and has to have a secretary to dictate to.
Yeah, you're halfway through What Maisie Knew, around 1897. Henry James really can't write anymore. I mean, what he's doing at the level of industry, and he's writing letters in the evening, so his hand just gives up. And he gets a dour Scot called McAlpine, who simply types what he writes, and James walks up and down and writes. But he gets the pages back every evening, and he goes over them every evening. So it is, and he's also been living in language by this point, really for 30 years, day in, day out, living in language. So it isn't as though, every time he has a thought, it seems, a thought can make its way into a very long sentence without any interruption. And he can do this, and he can see it almost as he's working. So people say they can notice the moment where he stops writing and starts dictating. You cannot. It just, because we really know what few pages it was. It can't be done. But I started to think about it in the novel because he starts to write The Turn of the Screw, which is very frightening. And of course, he now has an audience, not an audience in the future, but he has a Scot whose job is to type everything he's saying. And he really wants, in my novel, to frighten the Scot. Just if you get one look of scared look, the Scot isn't giving him a single moment's help. And later on, he gets he gets a wonderful woman who just adores him. And he writes the three masterpieces, The Wings of the Dove, The Golden Bowl, and The Ambassadors. And he doesn't write them, he dictates them. And people say you can feel that, and I don't. I think that but I couldn't do it. Could you do it?
No.
Could you?
No. I couldn't remember stuff. I couldn't remember. It's very important but you can do this by going over the pages, of course, by seeing the pages every night. But it's also important when you're sort of pushing that sentence on toward its end. It's kind of important for me to have in my mind what I did. And I think if I were dictating it, I wouldn't remember it as well.
But I think there's something crucial here with you, where with Frank Bascombe and with Canada, where you're. It's somebody speaking. It's speech. The illusion is you're creating. The illusion is speech, right. But it's not speech.
No.
It's writing, even though it's meant to look like speech. And that what you're managing is this very strange thing, what I referred to earlier as a sort of calm poetry, that you're getting within the speech, which is a sort of writing. So you're not trying to disguise the fact. In other words, it's not like it's not like As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, which is all just somebody speaking who really isn't good at speaking.
Dewey Dale Bundren.
Yeah, get their grammar wrong. You don't do that. You allow the speech a sort of rhythm, which is a writerly rhythm, even though it's first-person narrative, which is what I was referring to earlier. Yeah. I think that would be very difficult to say out loud as you were working.
I know I wrote a screenplay a few years ago, and everybody always said to me, "You write really good dialogue." So I thought, well, shit, then I should be able to write a movie. So I wrote a movie, and it all sounded like what we think of as literary dialogue. It was wrong. It didn't sound like anybody really talking. And as you say, it's writing. And it's understood by the reader to be writing, even though it may be subliminal understanding. You understand that it is not someone talking. It's someone writing a sentence that avers that someone's talking.
Is it difficult to end a book?
Well, it's part of the deal. It's part of the deal. You write it, you end it. So it's, in a way, for me, I think it's one of the most thrilling times in the life of a book. Not because the work is finished, because it's not happy when the work is finished, in a way. Because you have been doing this as hard as you can and as patiently as you can and as well as you can, then that gesture is over, and there's a certain kind of melancholy involved in it. But to actually write the ending movement of a novel, if it's 5 pages, if it's 2 pages, irrespective of what it is, for me, is one of the most exhilarating moments that I ever get to experience.
Yeah, and it requires this care because you have to soften the thing, bring it down. You can't bring in new images. Somehow or other, every image you find has to be one that's just got a downward feel to it. And even with the rhythm, even if it's not noticeable to the reader, the rhythm has to, some way or other, just move in on itself a bit. So you're not expanding the rhythm. You're just, I mean, it's a funny business.
But you harrow back through the book to see what you've got available to you.
Yeah.
For a word or an image or a thought or an idea, and you can bring that to bear upon the end in a way that is meant to be quite satisfying and consoling to the reader, because you're saying to the reader, I have let you in at the beginning, I've taken you through to the middle, now in the best possible way I can, I'm going to let you out.
Richard,
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Colm Tóibín.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.